Good afternoon, and welcome to Is Depression a Feminist Issue? A perspective from Feminist Theology with Dr. Jessica Coblentz. My name is Annie Selleck. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of the Women's Center at Georgetown University. We're thrilled to be marking Women's History Month with this event, a timely examination of a central topic on college campuses and beyond. I want to begin today by thanking our sponsors. The Women's Center is joined by the Gender Justice Initiative, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and the Disability Studies program in bringing Dr. Coblentz for this event. We also have copies of Dr. Coblentz's recent book, Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, available for students in the Women's Center. You can stop by Levy 327 between 12 and 4 to pick up a free copy of this book this week. This talk naturally touches upon many sensitive and urgent topics, including mental health, self-harm, and suicide. I'd like to remind you of the many resources available on campus for Georgetown students, faculty, and staff. Students can contact CAPS by calling 202-687-6985, and faculty and staff can use the Faculty and Staff Assistant Program by emailing fsap@georgetown.edu. I'll also place these phone numbers in the chat. The Women's Center, of course, is a resource, and we're available 12 to 4, Monday through Friday. Throughout our talk today, I invite you to place questions in the question and answer section of Zoom. We're also joined by 2 ASL interpreters. And if you'd like ASL interpretation, please adjust your view in the upper corner in order to see Steve and Wendy, our 2 interpreters. We have live captioning available too, which you can enable on Zoom. And now I'm pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jessica Coblentz. Jessica Coblentz is an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, where she also serves as a faculty research fellow at the college's Center for Women's Intercultural Leadership. Her teaching and her research focus on Catholic systematic theology, feminist theologies, and mental health and theological perspective. She is the author of Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, and co-editor of The Human in a Dehumanizing World, Re-examining Theological Anthropology and Its Implications, due out later this year. In addition to her contributions to numerous academic journals and essay collections, her writing has been featured in popular venues such as the National Catholic Reporter, U.S. Catholic, America, and Give Us This Day, where she's a regular contributor. Before working as a theologian, Dr. Coblentz served for several years in Roman Catholic national and diocesan religious education, parish young adult ministry, and college campus ministry. She earned her PhD in systematic theology from Boston College and is also a graduate of Harvard University and Santa Clara University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Coblentz.
Thanks so much, Dr. Selleck, and thanks also to our ASL interpreters and our captioner and to all of the sponsors that are enabling me to be with you all today. Dr. Selleck invited me to speak on my book, Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression. I was thrilled by the opportunity to be in conversation with all of you, and especially to talk about this project in relation to the larger field of feminist theology. So today I want to do this in 3 parts. First, I'll discuss why I, as a Catholic feminist theologian, see depression as a matter of concern. From there, I'll say a bit about how my work as a feminist theologian led me to reflect on depression as a wilderness experience. And I'll conclude with an account of what this particular theological approach to depression can afford those of us invested in Christian feminist theology. Most of us here are probably accustomed to hearing about issues like depression from psychologists or social workers or perhaps mental health activists. In mainstream conversation, depression isn't often framed as a theological issue, and we don't often talk about it as a feminist issue either. That's why I want to share about why I, as a Catholic feminist theologian, recognize depression as a feminist issue. As with every subfield, Christian feminist theology houses a diversity of methodologies and guiding principles. Yet two major approaches to feminist theology have prevailed in recent years, each of which is guided by commitments that lead me to see depression as a feminist issue. First, when feminist theology emerged in the second half of the 20th century, women's experience was front and center. Observing that all theology reflects the experiences and social context of its authors, feminist theologians decried how in theological texts, women's experiences are often overlooked or even actively maligned. As a corrective to this, feminist theology came to focus on the aspects of women's lives once deemed too marginal for God talk, and considered how more mainstream patriarchal theologies negatively shaped these experiences. In turn, this approach to feminist theology sought religious truths that better women's experiences, something they believed to be the will of God. For feminist theologians grounded in and guided by women's experience, the fact that any women experience depression makes it a worthy topic of reflection. Yet women don't just experience depression. Research regularly reports that women in the US are twice as likely to experience depression than men. Among the many women who give birth, 10 to 15% experience postpartum depression. And as members of other marginalized communities, many women are also prone to experience different rates and severities of this condition. Transgender youth are nearly 4 times more likely to experience depression than their cisgender peers. Meanwhile, cis lesbian, bisexual, and queer teens experience significantly more depressive symptoms and higher rates of suicidality than their heterosexual peers. Among feminist theologians who care about women's experiences, we need to attend to the devastating rates of depression among LGBTQ women and girls. Likewise, feminist theologians concerned with women's experiences must attend to the fact that racial minorities with depression in the US are more likely to experience extended and severely debilitating symptoms than white Americans with the same condition. Even this very brief excursus on women's experiences of depression demonstrates the condition's prevalence and its diversity. It is due in part to the impossibility of one exhaustive and truly inclusive account of any kind of women's experience, including depression, that a second approach to feminist theology emerged. This second approach to feminist theology focuses its reflection on resisting the multiple and intersecting structures of oppression that affect women and other people in detrimental ways. This approach is thus distinguished by its focus on politics rather than on any particular subset of experiences. Depression should also be a matter of concern for feminist theologians of this political bent. For systems of oppression account for some of the disparities we see in the aforementioned statistics about depression. For example, Dana Crowley-Jack observes how sexist affect norms shape the depression of white women in heterosexual marriages, who regularly suppress negative feelings in order to embody the ideal of the good wife, who is friendly and smiling all the time. Western society has long promised white women that actualizing this ideal will bring self-satisfaction and meaningful intimacy. But as Betty Friedan famously conveys in The Feminist Mystique, and as cultural critic Sarah Ahmed more recently shows, women who find themselves unable to reach and sustain this idealized image of the happy wife are told to judge and blame themselves for their failure. This in turn magnifies the self-loathing and isolation of depression. In conversation with Crowley-Jack, Shaniqua Walker-Barnes illustrates how these oppressive affective norms are mediated in the lives of Black women by the archetype of the strong Black woman. Emotional strength or regulation is the central defining characteristic of the strong Black woman, she explains. This controlling image leads Black women to repress negative emotions to their own detriment, which Walker Barnes demonstrates with a devastating look at mental health struggles among Black women. While these oppressive social realities contribute to women's depression, there are also systemic injustices, from the inequalities in healthcare coverage and access to mental health stigma, that additionally burden those who live with this condition. Thus, for those who align with feminist theology, be it on the grounds of women's experience or in shared opposition to sexist oppression and other forms of injustice, or those feminist theologians who identify with both, depression should be a matter of concern. When I recognized this and determined to undertake a project on depression, my knowledge of the long history of misrepresenting women's experience compelled me to ground my theological reflection in the experiences and perspectives of depression sufferers themselves. And sure enough, when I listened to them, I discovered a significant disparity between how sufferers represent and interpret their depression on the one hand, and how others tend to speak about it on the other. In everyday talk about depression, it's common to hear people like you and me characterize it as a form of long and severe sadness. Yet the narratives of depression sufferers tell us that living with depression is not just a series of bad days, which is an unfortunate part of how everyone experiences the world from time to time. Rather, sufferers often describe their depression as a kind of dislocation into another world. It is a harsh reality where their otherwise typical experiences of connection, meaning-making, and agency diminish or dissipate altogether. This imagery of displacement into another world conveys that depression is far more encompassing than ordinary emotion. It is a radical shift in one's experience of life. What's more, depression is an unfamiliar and uncomfortable world, an alien and unearthly landscape. It is, to use the apt language of phenomenology, a decidedly unhome-like place. While characterizations of depression as mere sadness miss these distinctive and difficult features, alongside them are two kinds of messages that US Christians tend to espouse about mental illness, both of which also diverge from how many depression sufferers describe and understand their own condition. The first popular Christian message casts depression as a sin, or as the result of a sufferer's sinfulness. It sees depression as a symptom of one's lack of faith, for example, or as God's punishment for some other misbehavior. This moral diagnosis appeals to some Christians because it promises that repentance from sin can heal and stave off depression. But other Christians are put off by this explanation, which can seem to shame and stigmatize depression sufferers by blaming them. The second common Christian message about depression frames it as a sacred gift, a special cross to bear, or a dark night of the soul that God bestows upon people to help them grow in faith. Some Christians find this to be a hopeful message that inspires them to persevere and search for meaning amid their mental pain. Yet to others, this sounds like a message of toxic positivity, one that dismisses the horrors and meaninglessness that constitute many experiences of depression. Altogether, we can see how ordinary talk about depression, both in secular and in religious terms, often leaves something to be desired. As a feminist, these messages often remind me a bit of mansplaining, of those times when a man explains things to a woman about which the woman knows more. For those who seek another portrait of depression that aligns with many sufferers' experience of it as something quite different than sadness, and for those who are left unsatisfied by prevailing Christian messages about this condition. How else might we describe and understand this condition? I found that once again, we need only listen to the stories of depression sufferers to find some really rich theological alternatives. As I just mentioned, sufferers regularly characterize their depression as an experience of dislocation into a strange and inhospitable world. Depression is an engrossing, harsh landscape, a wilderness even. This resonates with other profoundly Christian ways of talking about human experience. Christianity's sacred scriptures abound with stories of dislocation into unhomelike places. Indeed, so plentiful is this imagery in the scriptural canon that Walter Brueggemann characterizes the Bible as primarily concerned with the issue of being displaced and yearning for a place. He labels the Israelites a landless folk and God's homeless people because of the frequency with which they are unmoored from home and immersed in a harsh and unfamiliar place. These unfamiliar places are often called wildernesses, a term that a term that has both literal and figurative uses in the scriptures. Literally, wildernesses were specific terrains in the ancient world compared to, say, valleys or gardens. These wilderness terrains were known to be difficult to domesticate in service of human flourishing. Because the literal wilderness was known for its inhospitality to human life, biblical authors frequently employed the wilderness as a symbolic image as well. A symbolic image for human experiences of precarity, struggle, and even fatality. Thus, even when the Bible depicts actual earthly turf, these places often simultaneously function in the text as symbols for something else. It's no surprise then that over the course of Christian history, religious teachers and writers read biblical stories of literal untamed lands as meaningful analogs for the human struggles of the present day. This long tradition of correlating biblical wildernesses to contemporary experience has not only helped Christians see the realities of their lives in the sacred scriptures, it has also afforded them insights about how God relates to the circumstances of their own time. Carrying forth this tradition, I suggest that Christians can see depression as a contemporary wilderness experience, and in so doing, use the wilderness tales of the Bible to learn how God might relate to their depression. My book, Dust in the Blood, considers various biblical tales of dislocation into unfamiliar lands, from Abraham's sojourn to the Exodus to the Babylonian exile, to tease out their theological implications for contemporary experiences of depression. Along the way, I show that some of these stories lend themselves to existing Christian messages about depression. For example, taking up Abraham's sojourn to Canaan as an analog for depression, one might identify depression as a journey towards a better place that God intends, like a sacred gift or a holy cross to bear. In another example, the prophetic calls to repentance that echo across the writings of the Babylonian exile could suggest that depression sufferers are morally culpable for their suffering and should in turn repent if they ever want to escape this harrowing condition. Though these two examples show that some wilderness correlations lend themselves to views of depression that are already quite prevalent in US Christian communities, there are other wilderness stories that offer something different that can expand Christian messages about depression in new ways. One such wilderness narrative that I've become particularly captivated by is that of Hagar in Genesis 21. This often overlooked biblical woman became an important part of my reflection on depression, thanks to the work of womanist theologian Dolores Williams, whose classic Sisters in the Wilderness identifies the suffering of African-American women with the wilderness experiences of Hagar. Hagar was an enslaved woman in the house of Abraham and his wife Sarah. After Hagar becomes pregnant with Abraham's child, she flees into the wilderness where she encounters God, who instructs her to return to the clan with her newborn son, Ishmael. When we meet Hagar again, she has returned to life with Abraham and Sarah, who now has a son of her own, Isaac. When the sight of young Ishmael and Isaac together provokes Sarah to demand Hagar's expulsion, Abraham consults God and eventually complies with Sarah's wish. Hagar is displaced into the wilderness with her infant son, and having been given very little water, they soon find themselves in death-bound circumstances. From this wilderness, Hagar cries out to God, "Do not let me look upon the death of the child." God then calls to Hagar and opens her eyes to a well of water. Hagar's story ends there in the wilderness as the text gives way to Ishmael's story. Based on the text itself, Hagar's subsequent lifetime in the wilderness cannot be justified as an inherent good, as something worthwhile for the spiritual edification it promises, nor can it be explained as a punishment for sin when there is no mention of anything about her sin. Furthermore, recognizing that Hagar's suffering results from the malice of Abraham and Sarah does not explain why God relates to Hagar's suffering as God does, permitting it and withholding rescue from life in this harsh landscape. As far as we can tell, her displacement into the wilderness and the suffering she endures there is nonsensical, meaningless. It's a theological mystery. This makes Hagar's wilderness experience different from Abraham's or the Exodus or the Babylonian exile, all of which disclose justifications for why God allows the Israelites to be displaced and to suffer as they do. At the same time, Hagar's suffering clearly matters to God. In a previous wilderness experience, Hagar had named this God the God who sees, and then named her son Ishmael, meaning God hears. Although God does not reveal to Hagar a justification or a purpose for her suffering, God does see and hear her in her suffering. God is present to Hagar's pain in ways that many depression sufferers identify as significant. What's more, by opening Hagar's eyes to this vital well of water, God reveals new possibilities for survival and improved quality of life that Hagar herself could not perceive. Observing this, Dolores Williams cites the womanist adage that God makes a way out of no way. By revealing new possibilities for living in this death-bound place, God helps Hagar chart an otherwise unforeseen path for her life. In view of this, we can see how bringing Hagar's wilderness experience to bear on contemporary depressive suffering could affirm those whose depression resists standard Christian messages of justification and purpose, while at the same time inviting sufferers to consider whether their depression might nevertheless matter to the benevolent God of the Christian faith, the God who is profoundly concerned with and attentive to suffering and distress. Hagar's story also invites depression sufferers to hold out for the emergence of yet unforeseen possibilities of community and agency and meaning and hope, possibilities that depression sufferers so often long for, but cannot often perceive at the worst of their condition. Now, having shown how my commitments as a feminist theologian led me to reflect on depression as a wilderness experience, and having shown how this approach to depression can afford various theological possibilities for interpreting this condition in relation to God, including some, like the story of Hagar, that introduce alternatives to common Christian messages about this condition, I want to conclude my prepared remarks by naming some of the unique affordances of this particular theological approach to depression. First, approaching depression as a wilderness experience immediately expands our scriptural resources for reflection on this condition. Most often, Christians read depression into the scriptures in a literal fashion. They identify the lamentations of Jeremiah as depression, for example, suggesting that the prophet experienced the same condition that many people do today. In addition to presenting some historiographical problems, this literal approach narrows the relevance of biblical texts to scenes of sadness and misery alone. While such scenes are not uncommon in the canon, they constitute but one rather limited option for bringing depression into conversation with the scriptures. Additionally, this literal approach reinforces that common reduction of depression to sadness, which many depression sufferers dismiss as inaccurate, as I noted earlier. As a feminist theologian, I want to honor how sufferers name their own experience. Thus, correlating depression to wilderness imagery has the potential to both expand possibilities for interpreting depression within the biblical narrative and to extend more resources to sufferers who don't identify their depression with sadness alone. Sometimes equating depression with sadness is a means of diminishing the extraordinary difficulty of this condition. In view of that, a second affordance of approaching depression as a wilderness experience is that it can better honor the difficulty of depression, something else sufferers attest to, but which is often denied or downplayed by others. For all the variance in the Bible's theological associations with the wilderness is clearly and consistently depicted as a difficult place for people to inhabit. Though the wilderness is also a place where people often encounter God in transformative ways, that doesn't negate the intrinsic inhospitality of this landscape. Thus, to correlate depression with the biblical image of the wilderness is to affirm from a Christian perspective that depression is a tremendously difficult condition for living, though one not necessarily absent from the presence of God. The third affordance of approaching depression as a wilderness experience concerns the multiple and divergent theological implications of this biblical imagery. Some might see the theological diversity of this biblical image as a shortcoming of this paradigm for depression. After all, suggesting that depression is a wilderness experience will not immediately settle all of the pressing questions that sufferers bring to the Christian tradition, such as, why me, or what should I do, or what will come of this suffering. Biblical wilderness imagery resists any simple or simplistic response to these inquiries, for the Bible's diverse wilderness tales offer multiple responses to these questions. Though some may find this confusing or unhelpful, there is also reason to see this multivalence as precisely what makes this imagery such a fecund source for depression sufferers seeking to interpret their conditions. The theological plurality of wilderness imagery is an alternative, even a corrective to the exclusionary messages that Christians often impose onto suffering. It's a corrective to that analogous mansplaining that I mentioned earlier. The message that your depression is because of your sin, or that your depression is a gift from God that you must submit to, these prescriptive messages delimit how sufferers should view and relate to their suffering and their God. They preemptively constrain Christian possibilities for meaning making and belie the mystery of suffering. if this sliver of theological interpretation does not work for a depression sufferer, then she may be left to believe that Christianity has little else to offer her. What's more, the exclusivity of such messages about depression reflects a degree of theological certainty that is simply dishonest. We don't know for certain how God relates to the suffering of others. So why are we imposing these interpretations of depression onto others as if we did? Alternatively, for the sufferer who is invited to explore how her suffering is and is not akin to the wilderness experiences of the scriptures, she will find not one set of theological claims to accept or reject, but rather a panoply of theological possibilities to consider. Some depression sufferers may engage wilderness narratives and interpretations of them that reinscribe prevailing Christian messages about depression. Others may not. Whatever the case, though, opening up multiple theological possibilities could be a valuable offering to depression sufferers because it equips them to be theological agents in their own right. This may be especially helpful for women depression sufferers. I noted earlier that several feminist scholars link women's depression to social norms that urge women to silence or sublimate their emotions and perspectives. To the extent that this silencing of the self contributes to and magnifies women's depression, equipping women with more theological resources to confidently engage in reflection on their own suffering could be a significant short-term means of resistance to the social pressures that dismiss women's affective realities, while in the meantime, feminists continue to work to transform the social and religious constructions of gender that compel women to silence themselves in the first place. A related fourth affordance of this approach concerns the experiential and interpretive shifts that frequently occur across the course of living with chronic and recurring depression. Sociologist David Karp's work shows that the meanings a sufferer assigns to her depression may resonate and serve her for a time, but a need for alternative interpretations sometimes emerges as her condition and her context shifts. Just like the Israelites, who as one community had multiple wilderness experiences and various interpretations of them, so too the wilderness that a depression sufferer initially identifies with may not be the one she always associates with her experiences and interpretations of depression. It is conceivable that an image as theologically multivalent as the wilderness may be able to accommodate some of these fluctuations, remaining relevant to a sufferer even as she weighs different interpretations of her condition. Fifth, just as the plurality of wilderness imagery may be a refreshing alternative to a religious context where Christians tend to impose judgment, telling one another what their suffering must mean, this multiplicity may also be an appealing resource in a broader social context where mental health conditions such as depression are maligned and stigmatized. For this point, I am indebted to theologian Richard Arundel, who, building on the work of Susan Sontag, notes how talk about depression in church and society tends to characterize it antagonistically, as an enemy that is hostile towards us and that needs to be overcome and destroyed. Though some depression sufferers certainly characterize their own depression this way, sometimes quite literally identifying their depression as the work of the devil, Arundel cautions that the prevalence of this perspective in society limits sufferers' possibilities for interpreting and responding to their conditions. Here, Arundel is naming how narrative and metaphorical language can shape and limit one's perceptions of themselves. And in the case of society's antagonistic metaphors for mental health conditions, he argues that they have the power to perpetuate harmful ideas about conditions like depression. He writes, if we dwell in the language of the negative and the military, think enemy, there is a serious danger that this will set the agenda for the people this language is used for and against. When framed this way, depression is positioned as but one more aspect of a woman's embodied experience that she is socialized to hate and to eliminate. Arundel points to the biblical image of the wilderness as an alternative to this, and it is precisely its theological plurality and ambiguity that makes it appealing. Unlike the enemy language that perpetuates the negative judgments against mental health conditions that prevail in our society, speaking of depression as a wilderness need not bring with it these inherently pejorative associations. In fact, the Bible is full of wilderness experiences wherein a person blossoms, where one meets God in a new way. The multivalence of wilderness imagery with its range of moral associations is therefore a potential corrective to the almost singular negativity of society's views of depression and other mental health conditions. Lastly, approaching depression as a wilderness experience positions Christians for the kind of extra ecclesial coalition building that is so central to feminist theology and so necessary for responding to the complex and widespread suffering of depression. For while the wilderness is a longstanding and well-developed Christian symbol, its significance is not uniquely Christian. The wilderness tales I focused on today are from the Hebrew scriptures that Christians share with the Jewish community. Some of these stories also have parallels in the revelation of the Quran. More generally, wilderness need not even be a religious symbol, which means that secular depression sufferers and their allies may also encounter this as a resonant means for reflecting on their condition. Reflecting on depression through a lens that bridges between and beyond religious communities can be an asset because, as feminist theologians know so well, addressing the systems of oppression that contribute to and magnify depression requires that many voices across many communities work in concert to advance social transformation. Approaching depression as a wilderness experience could aid this sort of cross-community mobilization. To conclude, I want to emphasize that while my book and my remarks today focus on viewing depression as a wilderness experience, I don't see this as the only way to effectively understand and respond to depression from a Christian perspective, nor do I see this as my own last word when it comes to feminist reflection on this topic. For instance, there is much more to say about how Catholic and other Christian constructions of womanhood, as well as the church's broader sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia contribute to and magnify depression. Feminist theology offers really important critiques, but also compelling theological alternatives to these realities. And it will take our collaboration and continued commitment in order to cultivate more of these theological resources and ignite the social change that is necessary to make our communities better and more livable for those with depression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coblentz, for that really important and inviting overview of your work and connection to our work within Georgetown University and the Women's Center. I want to remind the audience that you can place questions in the Q&A tab of Zoom, and I'll be moderating that and can ask that to Dr. Coblentz. But to start out, I have a question for you, which I I'm thinking of how feminist theology always connects to action, right? This is one of the pillars. And I think when you talk about the coalition building and wilderness being a way of building community and coalitions, I think that's a really important part. Another part that it made me think of, though, and I'm taking this from the end of your introduction in your book, for those who haven't read it, right, I'll read this part out loud. But Dr. Coblentz concludes her introduction by saying, in defiance of the stigma that has long hidden this suffering, confining it to the privacy of counseling offices, confessionals, and sometimes only the silent prayer of our hearts, I hope for more discussion of what depression is, who we are, what we ought to be for one another, and who God is in the midst of this difficult condition. And one thing I was thinking in this is that on a college campus, right, like Georgetown, like St. Mary's, the sense of what we ought to be for one another is a really crucial part. And I think that's something that feminist theology can bring out, right? How is this connected to action? So I'd love to hear you speak on how you see this on college campuses, especially what are your thoughts about how we ought to be to one another in the midst of this?
It's a great question, Dr. Selleck, and there's so much that could be said about this. I think the first thing I want to affirm about these issues on college campuses is that I find that many undergraduate students today have a great deal to teach folks of other generations, particularly a lot of the folks with power in institutions like college campuses, institutions like the church. Just the literacy of younger generations around mental health. They're willing to speak openly about it, boldly about it, in ways that sometimes make other people uncomfortable, but are necessary. Sometimes stigmatized issues should need to be talked about despite people's discomfort, and so I just want to affirm that for older adults on college campuses, I think one thing that we can do to start to think about how we should be for each other is to actually look to our students, to look to younger generations and see how they are already showing up for each other in the ways that they talk about this, in the way that they encourage one another to seek mental health support, and in the way that many young people today are mobilizing on their campuses to advocate for more resources. So again, turning to them, I think, is a really important thing, and listening to what they say they need. I also think that one of the things that we try to do in education is to equip students with different perspectives and rich language for talking about their own experiences so that they can continue to advocate for themselves and also challenge others to create a better world. And I think as a theologian, I try to work hard to offer my students theological resources and language to help them advocate for themselves in Christian communities, including Catholic Christian colleges like ours. And I would love to see, places like campus ministry or divisions of mission go out of their way to meet students where they are with these mental health issues, and to also join in helping students learn how to advocate for themselves, and talk about these issues in faith communities, so that when they leave college campuses, if they're interested in continuing this activism or helping faith communities work on this, that they will be ready to do that.
I think that leads right into the next question that we have from the audience, which is, What do you believe a feminist theological approach to depression looks like in the church? What resources are offered? And for this, I would say, we can think of church broadly as church, specifically as in a Catholic context, as a Catholic church, or the more broad church.
This is a great question. When people often ask me, like, what can churches do to support people? There's a host of answers that I could give, but I think the questioner's focus on a feminist theological approach to this in the church leads me to really emphasize the fact that there is a great deal of like systemic transformation that needs to happen in order to both mitigate depression, but also support those who are living with depression. And I think churches and all faith communities are positioned so well to advocate for the kind of broad scale systemic change that is so needed in relation to this issue. I think often people in churches are, when they're thinking about mental health or any kind of social issue, people often think, oh, well, if we just kind of mention it in our prayers, or we put a little announcement in the weekly bulletin, that will make all the difference. Those things, those little things make a difference. But I think one of the great reminders from feminist theology is that, like, being nicer to people or mentioning certain realities more does not do most of the work that we need. It does not change the world. It's a step, it's important. But if these issues like mental health stigma, like racism, sexism, transphobia, if these issues are truly systemic, cultural, large-scale issues, then we need systemic, cultural, and large-scale changes. Because churches and other faith communities are by their very nature communal, it's not just one person doing good work, it's people coming together to do good work. The potential to make an impact on these larger social issues is there in a unique way. And I would love to see churches do more on a sort of activist level or advocacy level to address these issues.
Great. Another question that came in from Professor Fink is that I'll just read the question as we go, but you alluded in your spectacular talk to the ways Christianity in particular can be a sort of disabling condition. It's misogynistic, patriarchal, homophobic structures and practices potentially exacerbating depression in women. Do you see a contradiction in turning to Christian narratives like the trope of the wilderness to ameliorate this depression?
This is a great question. And I think one that sort of brings me back to why I fell in love with feminist theology in particular. When I started my theological education, I think one of the really incisive insights of feminist theology is that religious communities can do a great deal of harm and at the same time really do wonderful things in people's lives. And that is why so many feminist theologians continue to locate themselves within faith communities, is because while there is sexism and homophobia and racism and transphobia, many feminists still believe that there are alternative great resources within faith communities in the present, in the kind of theological resources and scriptures of the past that can help to transform these communities and the problems that are within them, and even can help to transform society more broadly. And I'm a feminist theologian who believes that. I think faith communities, as I was just saying, have the potential to do tremendous good in the world. They do tremendous good in the world, and they do tremendous harm. And I think, when one reads the scriptures, I often talk about this with my students. It seems like from the biblical narrative that this has long been the case. God has long been telling people of faith that they're not living up to what they ought to be doing, but that they have stories and resources to do better. And as a theologian, I hope that that is the case within Christianity. And I feel like part of my vocation as a theologian is to push Christians in that direction towards the good and away from the kind of sinful realities like racism, sexism, many of the things you named.
Yes. So this next question is looking at both in your book and in the talk today, you talked about kind of these popular accounts, popular theologies around depression. So depression is self-imposed, depression is divine instruction. And so the question is, how would you recommend that we engage in conversation with people who espouse popular Christian beliefs about depression, which my own hunch is most of the people who we talk to, and families, friends, right? How can we introduce the wilderness perspective to these people so that we can seek better understanding?
Mm-hmm. I think the circumstances in which I encounter these messages would affect the way that I respond to it. I think if somebody is espousing one of these Christian views of depression when they're talking about their own suffering, I think it's important to know whether this kind of way of interpreting their condition is helping them. I noted in my talk that when people are really suffering, sometimes people take great consolation in these messages. And often it doesn't help a person to say like, well, actually, you're wrong. It's not kind of practically helpful when people are suffering. I think also there's a way in which kind of a universal dismissal of these Christian messages can also be dishonest, right? I don't actually know how God relates to somebody else's suffering. Even if I feel uncomfortable with how a person is talking about it, dismissing that assumes that I know better when I really don't. So I think there's a sort of, that's a theological reason not to be so immediately dismissive. I think there are practical reasons too. That said, if people are kind of universalizing about these messages, they're trying to impose them on all people's depression or other people's depression. I think there are often opportunities to respond with curiosity, like, why do you think that? And if people are being universal about it, to say like, I'm not sure that everybody sees it that way. I think often as a teacher, something I enjoy doing is saying like, that's one way to look at it. Here are some other ways to look at it too. What do you think about this? Why do you think your view is the case and not another? Sort of responding with curiosity and openness, I think can help people realize, oh, the way that I think about this isn't necessarily the only way. And then the last thing I would say is that there are probably other circumstances where a person is really suffering and they might invite you into their own reflection about it. They might say, I'm really suffering and I don't know how to think about this in relationship to God. And in those circumstances, I think it's a wonderful gift to offer people some ways of thinking about their suffering. As I said, I don't think even this wilderness approach is the only way. So I don't personally see a need to say like, this is how you ought to do it. But I think to offer people the gift of different perspectives in those moments where they're really longing for help can be a really great thing.
The next question is, how do you think that people with depression can navigate the often consistent feeling of failure using these theological approaches and this wilderness imagery?
Yeah, that's a really, really difficult dimension of the experience of depression for a lot of people. One thing that I really love about the wilderness story of Hagar in particular, which I talked about it at most length in the talk, is that the story to me reveals that when we are suffering, we don't often have a full perspective of reality, right? Hagar is thirsty. She laments that her son is going to die. She is going to die. And it's in that moment where God sort of opens her eyes to see that there's a well of water that was always there. She just couldn't see it in her desperation and in her suffering. And from my study of depression, and frankly, from my own experiences of it, I have found that this is often, the case for depression sufferers, that there are things that in our kind of rumination about failure, in our struggle to hope for a different way of living and experiencing the world, we often get stuck in a certain perspective and can't see beyond it. What I hope stories like Hagar's can offer us is a reason to hope that it won't always be that way, right? That God sometimes does open our eyes to seeing things a little bit differently than we do in this moment. I don't think you can force that, but I do hope that it gives depression sufferers a reason to hang on and wait, and a reason to believe that it won't always feel like this, because so many depression sufferers say, I felt like a failure. I never thought I would escape that feeling, but as time went on, I did. And I couldn't have foreseen that. So I hope stories like Hagar's give us a reason to hold out hope.
Thank you. I have one final question before we wrap up today. And it's switching gears a little bit, but looking at that feminist theology often is done in community, right? And we inherit the feminist theology that's passed down, and that's actively being creative, and also recognizing we're in Women's History Month, right? And that's why we're hosting this event. And Women's History Month is about recognizing many who have shaped us, yet who have been marginalized, or their stories haven't been centered, and bringing people to the center. So could you tell us about a woman, or maybe a few people who has shaped your own life and has shaped your work?
So many women come to mind. It's such a great question. I'll mention a scholar that I don't know personally, but who has really influenced my thinking in important ways. I'll mention her because those who want to read more about faith and depression can turn to her work. Her name is Monica Coleman, and she's a scholar of womanist theology and Africana religious traditions in her academic work. But she has also written two sort of popular memoirs about her experiences with bipolar depression. One is called Bipolar Faith, and that's a kind of long memoir about her experiences. And then, I'm forgetting the name. She also has I'm forgetting the name. She also has another kind of short 40-day devotional of what were basically blog posts about faith and depression that is similar. Both are really excellent in terms of their theological resources, but also so moving to me as just a very personal disclosure of her struggles. I had a really incredible experience of hearing her speak in person after reading her memoirs and studying her work for many years. And at the beginning of her talk, she said, I am an academic who occasionally loses my mind. And there was something so moving to me about the way she put that, about her courage as an academic, right? Just like, students, professors are in the business of relying on our minds to do our work in really important ways, and in ways that can make mental health struggles feel especially threatening. And so her courage and boldness in naming that mental health struggles are a part of her life as a scholar and as a person really inspired me, and I think might inspire others. So I do recommend her work.
Great, thank you. And I put her website in the chat. So if any of you are on the chat now and want to click on that, she does a wonderful podcast as well too, and really accessible. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Coblentz, for joining us today, for offering your experiences, your insight, and for inviting us to join you in this coalition building to help create both our campus community, our larger church, and also to create a more just society where we can center these experiences and they're no longer relegated to silence, but we see people and recognize the dignity within. So I thank you for that today. Thank you to our captioner and to our ASL interpreters for helping making this event more accessible. And again, for everyone at Georgetown, I'm placing in the chat some resources. If this talk has brought up anything that you want to talk about more in depth, there are many resources at Georgetown on campus. I've highlighted both CAPS and the Faculty Staff Assistance Program, but there are resources both on and off campus that we can help connect you with. Again, thank you once again, Dr. Jessica Coblentz. And for everyone on campus, you can stop by the Women's Center to pick up a copy of Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression. And for all of you not on campus, you can pick this up at any number of booksellers. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today, and in a special way, Dr. Coblentz, for your work. Thank you.